Childhood trauma, or what researchers often call adverse childhood experiences, is not only about the big dramatic events we tend to imagine. Of course, some people do go through single, shocking experiences, an accident, an act of violence, or the sudden loss of a parent. But trauma is just as often made up of the quieter, more ongoing stressors that happen day after day. These experiences can shape a child's nervous system while it is still developing, and the effects are carried forward into adulthood. One of the landmark studies that revealed just how powerful these early experiences are is known as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, often called the ACE study. This research was conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in the 1990s with more than 17,000 adults. The participants were asked about different categories of childhood adversity, and then their health and relationship outcomes were tracked over time. The results were groundbreaking. The higher someone's ACE score, the greater their risk for things like chronic illness, addiction, depression, and difficulties in relationships. What this showed is that early emotional wounds don't stay in childhood, they echo throughout a lifetime. So what exactly counts as an ACE? The study identified categories such as emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, emotional or physical neglect, and household dysfunction, like growing up with a caregiver who struggled with substance use, mental illness, incarceration, or chronic conflict such as divorce. But beyond these categories, modern trauma research emphasizes something crucial. Trauma isn't about comparing pain. It's about what was too much, too fast, or too long for a child's developing nervous system to process. I like to call this the concept of enoughness. What overwhelms one child may not overwhelm another, and it's not about ranking who had it worse. It's about whether the child's needs for safety, attunement, and stability were consistently met. This is why clinicians talk about developmental trauma. Sometimes the most damaging wounds are not the things that happened, but the things that were missing. For instance, if a caregiver repeatedly failed to notice or respond to a child's cries for comfort, that child learned early on that their needs wouldn't be met. That lack of attunement, moment after moment, year after year, can be just as impactful as a single traumatic event. Neuroscience backs this up. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his influential work The Body Keeps the Score, describes how trauma is not just a psychological scar. It leaves an imprint on the body's stress systems, especially the brain and the autonomic nervous system. That's why trauma survivors may find themselves reacting to stress in adulthood with intense fight, flight, or freeze responses, even when the current situation doesn't seem dangerous. Their body is still wired for survival, as if the old threat is happening now. And here's something I really want to emphasize. The ways children adapt to trauma are not flaws. They are brilliant survival responses. A child who learned to stay quiet, to please, or to withdraw was doing what they needed to survive the environment they were in. These strategies were intelligent in that context. The challenge comes later, when those same adaptations show up in adult relationships, where they may create misunderstanding, distance, or pain. Our earliest relationships create a kind of blueprint, a template that shapes how we expect to be treated and how we think we must show up in order to be loved. Psychologists call this our attachment style. It is through attachment that childhood experiences echo most strongly in our adult relationships, often without us even realizing it. The groundwork for this understanding came from John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who first articulated attachment theory. He observed that humans have an innate drive to form a strong emotional bond with a primary caregiver, because that bond is not just about love, it's about survival. For a child, being close to a caregiver literally means protection, safety, and regulation of overwhelming emotions. Mary Ainsworth, a developmental psychologist who expanded on Bowlby's work, demonstrated how attachment works in practice through her famous strange situation study. She watched how infants responded when their caregiver left the room and then returned. Some children were soothed and returned to play when the caregiver came back. Others clung desperately, became inconsolable, or even avoided eye contact. These patterns revealed different attachment styles that, years later, researchers found to carry forward into adult relationships. In adulthood, we typically see four main attachment styles. A secure attachment means comfort with both intimacy and independence, a kind of natural confidence in relationships. An anxious, preoccupied style is marked by a craving for closeness, but an ongoing fear of abandonment, which can create a cycle of pursuing and worrying. A dismissive avoidant style leans heavily on independence and often minimizes or downplays the need for closeness, which can feel like distance to a partner. And then there is the fearful avoidant or disorganized style, which is the most conflicted, wanting closeness but feeling terrified of it at the same time. What's important to understand is that an insecure attachment style is not a fixed personality trait. It's an adaptation. If a child's caregivers were inconsistent, frightening, or emotionally unavailable, the child's nervous system had to adjust to survive in that environment. So, for example, a child who couldn't count on a parent to come back when they needed comfort might grow into an adult who clings tightly to partners, desperate not to be left. Or a child who learned that expressing needs led to rejection might grow into an adult who shuts down their feelings and prides themselves on being completely independent. Neuroscience helps explain why this blueprint runs so deep. Secure attachment in early years supports the healthy development of brain regions like the prefrontal cortex, which helps with regulation, empathy, and problem-solving. Insecure attachment and trauma, however, can leave the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, on high alert, while underdeveloping the parts of the brain responsible for calming it down. This means that in adult relationships, stress can activate old fear circuits, and the person may react in ways that feel automatic and disproportionate. But attachment is not destiny. Thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new pathways, we can rewire these patterns. This is often called earned security. Through therapy, healthy friendships, and safe partnerships, we can have corrective emotional experiences that gradually reshape our expectations of relationships. Over time, the nervous system can learn that closeness is safe, that independence doesn't mean abandonment, and that it's possible to have both connection and individuality in the same relationship. In other words, while the blueprint of attachment is laid down early, it is not carved in stone. The adult task is to recognize the old map we are following and to begin drawing a new one that leads us not back into survival, but forward into genuine connection. One of the most painful but also most fascinating ways childhood trauma shows up in adulthood is through reenactment. This is what psychologists call the trauma reenactment cycle. It's the unconscious compulsion to repeat old patterns from our childhood in our adult relationships, almost as if we're trying to go back and fix the original wound. Sigmund Freud first described this as repetition compulsion. He noticed that people often returned to situations that looked very much like the painful dynamics they had tried to escape. Importantly, it's not that someone wants to be hurt again. It's that the nervous system is trying to recreate the scene in the hope of finally achieving a different outcome. A child who is abandoned may unconsciously seek out partners who are emotionally distant, hoping this time the person will finally stay. The problem is our nervous system is wired more for familiarity than for health. If you grew up in chaos, chaos feels like home. A steady, reliable relationship may feel strange or even boring because the body isn't used to safety. So instead of seeking what is healthy, we often find ourselves drawn back into what is familiar. This can show up in many ways. Someone who grew up with a parent struggling with addiction may find themselves repeatedly drawn to partners with substance use issues. A person who had to earn love from a critical parent may unconsciously seek out partners who judge or criticize them because that is the script they already know. Someone who played the caretaker role for a depressed parent may find themselves in adulthood only feeling valuable when they are fixing or rescuing others. These aren't conscious choices, they are patterns written into the body's memory. And that's the key here, implicit memory. Unlike explicit memory, which is the conscious recollection of facts and events, implicit memory is stored in the body and emotions. We may not consciously think, this situation reminds me of my childhood, but our nervous system remembers. That's why people often feel flooded with overwhelming emotions in relationships without being able to explain why. It's the body remembering without words. Researchers have also found that trauma primes the brain with what's called a negativity bias. This means the brain becomes hyperalert to signs of threat, scanning constantly for proof of old painful beliefs such as, I am unlovable, or people always leave me. The brain tends to filter new experiences through these old lenses, often distorting what's actually happening. So a delayed text response from a partner may not just feel annoying, it can feel like abandonment, triggering panic that is disproportionate to the situation. The first step in breaking this reenactment cycle is awareness. Ask yourself, do I keep finding myself in the same arguments, the same kinds of relationships, the same painful roles? Do I end up feeling the same way I did as a child, unseen, unsafe, or unworthy? If so, that's not coincidence, that's reenactment. What's powerful is that once we recognize these patterns, we can begin to disrupt them. Instead of unconsciously repeating, we can start to consciously choose. It's not easy because the familiar will still feel magnetic, but numbing the pattern is the beginning of stepping out of it. When we see the cycle for what it is, we gain the chance to write a new script, one that isn't dictated by the past, but is shaped by the present moment and the relationships we want to create. For a child who experienced trauma, the world was not safe. And even more confusing, the very people who were supposed to provide protection may have been the source of danger. This creates a lifelong dilemma. The human need for connection is always there, but so is the survival need for protection. In adulthood, that often shows up as a wall, hypervigilance, trust issues, and a fear of vulnerability. Hypervigilance is one of the most common legacies of trauma. Many survivors describe living in a constant state of scanning, always reading the room, monitoring tone of voice, body language, and microexpressions for the slightest sign of danger. This isn't paranoia, it's adaptation. As children, they had to detect a caregiver's moods instantly, because missing a signal might mean punishment, rejection, or chaos. The cost in adulthood is exhaustion. It's hard to relax into love when your nervous system is on permanent guard duty. This leads directly into the issue of trust. Survivors of trauma often say, "I want to trust, I know this person is safe," but their body doesn't agree. Trust becomes a cognitive choice rather than a felt experience. They may intellectually decide to open up, but as soon as intimacy deepens, their nervous system screams danger. That internal conflict makes closeness both deeply desired and deeply threatening. The fear of vulnerability lies at the heart of this conflict. Researcher Brené Brown describes vulnerability as the birthplace of connection, but for someone whose childhood vulnerability was met with betrayal, rejection, or punishment, opening up can feel like walking into a lion's den. Their body doesn't register it as connection, it registers it as risk. Here it's useful to understand the concept of the window of tolerance, first described by psychiatrist Dan Siegel. The window of tolerance is the emotional zone where we can handle stress without becoming overwhelmed. Trauma shrinks that window. Small disagreements or misunderstandings can push someone outside of it into hyperarousal, anxiety, rage, panic, or hypoarousal, numbing, shutting down, dissociation. Either way, constructive problem solving becomes nearly impossible because the body has shifted into survival mode. Another layer is projection. Old fears and expectations get unconsciously projected onto a partner. If someone grew up expecting abandonment, they may see abandonment everywhere, even in neutral situations. A partner's request for space might be misinterpreted as rejection. This isn't stubbornness, it's the nervous system replaying an old script, trying to preempt the hurt it knows too well. Neuroscience helps explain why this wall feels so immovable. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory shows how trauma impacts the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system, instead of easily accessing the social engagement system, the calm, open state needed for connection. The body gets stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. Even in safe environments, the survivor's body may keep sounding the alarm, preventing the felt sense of safety that relationships require. So when we talk about trauma creating walls, we're not talking about stubbornness or personality flaws. We're talking about a body that was trained to survive in unsafe conditions and now struggles to believe that safety is real. Recognizing this can bring compassion to oneself and to one's partner, because the wall isn't built out of malice. It's built out of fear, and fear is a powerful teacher when we begin to listen to what it's trying to protect. The criticism that was external in childhood often becomes internalized in adulthood. What once came from a parent's words or silence transforms into an inner voice that never leaves. This is what we call the inner critic, and for many survivors of trauma, it dictates their sense of worth in relationships. Psychologists have long noted that children will often blame themselves rather than their caregivers. It may seem paradoxical, but it makes sense. If a child concludes, "I am bad, I am too much, I don't deserve love," then the world feels more predictable. Believing I am the problem gives the illusion of control, because if I change myself, maybe I can earn safety. The alternative, my caregiver cannot be trusted to meet my needs, is too terrifying for a child to hold on to. That self-blame becomes the seed of the inner critic. Over time, this critic hardens into core negative beliefs. I am unlovable. I am a burden. My needs don't matter. I have to be perfect to be accepted. These beliefs may operate quietly in the background, but they drive behavior in powerful ways. Someone who believes they are destined to be abandoned might cling tightly to a partner or test them constantly, behaviors that ironically push the partner away and confirm the old belief. That's how trauma creates self-fulfilling cycles. Perfectionism is another common legacy. On the surface, perfectionism looks like ambition or drive, but in many cases it is a trauma response. If love was conditional, only given when the child excelled, behaved perfectly, or stayed invisible, then being flawless feels like the only path to safety. The perfectionist adult isn't chasing excellence for its own sake. They are still chasing the hope that if they perform well enough, they will finally be safe and loved. Closely tied to this is what we now call imposter syndrome. That nagging fear of being exposed as inadequate often has roots in those early messages of not being enough. Even when success is achieved, the inner critic whispers, "This won't last. They'll find out who you really are." The result is a constant undercurrent of anxiety, even in the face of accomplishment. Another survival adaptation is the fawn response, described by therapist Pete Walker. This is when a child, faced with conflict or threat, learns to appease and please as a way of avoiding harm. In adulthood, this shows up as people-pleasing, abandoning one's own needs, overfunctioning for others, saying yes when the body wants to say no. It may look generous on the outside, but inside it is rooted in fear. If I don't keep you happy, I won't be safe. Neuroscience supports how deeply ingrained these patterns can become. Studies using brain imaging show that repeated criticism and neglect in childhood can heighten activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the region linked to error detection and self-monitoring. This makes the brain exquisitely sensitive to perceived mistakes or rejection, fueling the cycle of self-criticism. The inner critic, then, is not just a bad habit. It's the internalized voice of survival. But the important point is this: because it was learned, it can also be unlearned. The task in adulthood is not to silence the critic by force, but to begin questioning its authority. That begins with awareness, catching the critic in action, noticing its tone, and slowly separating its words from reality. Over time, the goal is not to erase the voice, but to recognize it for what it is, an echo of the past, not a truth about the present. Trauma doesn't just shape how we feel inside, it changes how we communicate, especially when conflict arises. In many relationships, arguments aren't just about the present disagreement. They're about old wounds being activated. The past hijacks the present. One helpful way to understand this is through Pete Walker's model of the 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. These are survival strategies, but in adult communication, they often derail healthy connection. The fight response shows up as blaming, criticizing, or trying to control the conversation. Flight can look like avoidance, leaving the room, shutting down texts, or distracting oneself to escape the discomfort. Freeze is when someone goes blank, unable to think clearly or speak, stuck in overwhelm. And fawn means immediately apologizing, appeasing, or conceding, not because you agree, but because you're desperate to end the conflict. These patterns aren't chosen in the heat of the moment, they're automatic. That's why disagreements can feel so intense for trauma survivors. It isn't just the argument, it's the nervous system reacting as if the old threat is happening all over again. Researchers have shown that trauma sensitizes the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, so even small relational stressors, like a raised voice, can trigger a flood of stress hormones. It's important to distinguish between an ordinary disagreement and a trauma trigger. In a disagreement, 2 people are addressing a current issue: who's doing the dishes, how money is being spent, or how time is divided. A trauma trigger, by contrast, pulls in the weight of the past. A partner's sigh might unconsciously remind someone of a parent's contempt, and suddenly they feel the same shame they felt as a child. That emotional time travel makes the reaction feel much bigger than the moment. Another common effect is the inability to self-advocate. If someone grew up in an environment where expressing needs was punished, ignored, or ridiculed, speaking up in adulthood can feel terrifying. They may avoid asking for what they need, only to feel resentful later. Or they may push their needs down until they erupt in ways that feel confusing to their partner. Conflict can also activate black and white thinking. In a triggered state, the brain struggles to access nuance. A small mistake can suddenly mean, "You never care about me," or "This relationship is doomed." It becomes all or nothing. This is a survival brain at work, collapsing complexity into absolutes because it feels safer to know where one stands, even if the conclusion is painful. That's why something seemingly minor can lead to a major reaction. It's like the old saying about the straw that broke the camel's back. The straw itself isn't the problem, it's the load that was already there. When someone explodes over a small issue, it's often not about that issue at all. It's about the buildup of unmet childhood needs and unspoken pain carried silently for years. Recognizing this can shift how we view conflict. Instead of asking only, "Why are we fighting about this?" we can begin to ask, "What old wound might this argument be stirring up?" That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it reframes the reaction. It helps partners see that the intensity often comes not from the present moment, but from the past bleeding into it. When couples start to recognize these trauma-driven communication patterns, they can begin to pause, step back, and name what's happening. Even that small act of awareness begins to loosen the grip of the past, making space for a different way of relating. Intimacy is one of the areas where the impact of childhood trauma becomes especially clear. By intimacy, I don't just mean romance. I mean the ability to let someone close, to feel safe in another person's presence, and to connect without walls. For many people with early trauma, this is where things become most complicated. For someone who grew up in a household that wasn't safe, the body often learned that closeness meant risk. As adults, this can show up as an aversion to touch, flinching at physical closeness, or simply feeling tense when a partner leans in for comfort. The reaction isn't about the partner, it's the nervous system remembering what closeness once meant. Others experience the opposite. They may equate closeness with caretaking, always being on for the other person, never fully able to relax. They learned as children that to stay connected, They had to stay useful, watchful, or emotionally available to others while ignoring their own needs. That can make adult relationships feel more like a job than a refuge. Another common pattern is dissociation. This is when someone disconnects from their feelings or even their body during moments of closeness. Dissociation was originally a survival tool, allowing a child to escape overwhelming situations by mentally checking out. But in adult relationships, it can prevent genuine presence and connection. A partner may notice the person shuts down emotionally or seems far away during moments that should feel bonding. The freeze response can also play out here. Instead of leaning into comfort, a person may go still, unable to respond to affection. Sometimes they agree to closeness outwardly but feel disconnected inwardly. This isn't rejection, it's a nervous system on autopilot, defaulting to what once kept them safe. And then there's the fawn response. Just as in conflict, people may default to pleasing behaviors in moments of intimacy. They might go along with closeness even when they don't feel comfortable, because saying no feels too risky. Over time, this can create deep disconnection from their own needs and boundaries. The hopeful part is that intimacy can be relearned. Therapies that focus on the body, such as somatic experiencing or mindfulness practices, help people notice their responses without judgment and slowly expand their capacity for closeness. Even small steps like practicing safe, non-demanding touch or learning to name boundaries clearly can help rebuild a sense of safety. At the heart of it, intimacy after trauma is about reclaiming agency. It's about learning that closeness can be chosen, not forced, that it's okay to say yes when it feels good, and equally okay to say no when it doesn't. And most importantly, that the body's protective reactions are not failures. They are reminders of just how hard that body worked to keep someone safe. When childhood trauma shapes adult relationships, it often creates very specific patterns in how we relate to partners. One of the clearest patterns is what people commonly call codependency, but this word is often misunderstood. Codependency isn't simply caring too much. It's about losing your sense of self in the relationship and trying to regulate your own safety and worth by managing another person. For many, this begins in childhood. If a parent was depressed, addicted, or emotionally unstable, a child may have taken on the role of caretaker. They learned to monitor the parent's moods, to provide comfort, or to step into adult responsibilities far too early. Over time, they came to believe their value was tied to how well they could keep others stable. As adults, they may only feel lovable when they are solving problems, supporting, or rescuing. This is where the illusion of control comes in. When we try to control a partner's choices, emotions, or even personality, it isn't because we're manipulative, it's because control feels safer than uncertainty. A child who grew up surrounded by unpredictability learned that being hypertensive and controlling was the only way to reduce chaos. In adulthood, this may look like trying to fix a partner, micromanaging their decisions, or panicking when they don't behave the way we expect. The underlying motive isn't domination, it's fear. A related pattern is enmeshment, which is often confused with intimacy. True intimacy means two whole people connecting while maintaining their individuality. Enmeshment, on the other hand, blurs the boundaries so thoroughly that one person's mood, identity, or sense of worth depends on the other. If a partner is upset, the enmeshed person cannot rest until they fix it, even at the expense of their own needs. The self disappears in service to the relationship. Another theme is the attraction to potential. Many survivors fall in love not with who someone is, but with who they could be. This comes straight from childhood, where they hoped if they could just try harder, their caregiver might change, become sober, become loving, become stable. That old hope transfers to partners. If I love them enough, if I help them enough, they'll transform into the person I need. But instead of creating closeness, this often leads to repeated disappointment and exhaustion. The toll of these dynamics is heavy. The caretaker eventually feels drained, unappreciated, and resentful. The partner being managed may feel suffocated, incapable, or resentful in return. What began as an attempt to create safety ends up creating distance and frustration for both people. The key to untangling these patterns is recognizing that love is not the same as caretaking, fixing, or controlling. Love allows two people to be fully themselves, to support each other without erasing individuality. Healing often means learning to step back, to tolerate the discomfort of not managing someone else's emotions, and to rediscover one's own identity outside of the relationship. In short, trauma may teach us that connection requires losing ourselves. Healing is the process of relearning that connection is possible while remaining whole. The first step in breaking trauma patterns is awareness. You cannot change what you cannot see. For many survivors, their behaviors in relationships feel normal because they are all they have ever known. Hypervigilance, people-pleasing, shutting down, or clinging feel like personality traits, but they are actually trauma responses. Awareness means starting to notice, what am I feeling in my body right now? What thoughts come up when my partner pulls away? What stories do I tell myself when I make a mistake? These observations may sound simple, but they are revolutionary. They begin to shine a light on the automatic patterns that have been running the show. A helpful framework here is mindfulness, not in the trendy sense of apps and buzzwords, but in its original meaning, paying attention on purpose without judgment. When a trigger happens, mindfulness allows us to pause long enough to see the old story surfacing. Instead of unconsciously reacting, we can start asking, is this reaction about the present moment, or is it an echo of the past? Another powerful tool is tracking themes. Survivors often find themselves repeating the same relational cycles, always feeling abandoned, always overgiving, always fearing rejection. Keeping a journal of these patterns can make the invisible visible. Over time, the same words and feelings will appear again and again, pointing directly to the old wound that is still active. Self-awareness also means recognizing the voice of the inner critic. The critic tends to speak in absolutes, always, never, should, not enough. Becoming familiar with its tone, sharp, urgent, shamming, helps separate it from the self. That separation is the first step in loosening its grip. Neuroscience shows that awareness itself begins to change the brain. When we catch ourselves mid-pattern, we are engaging the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reflection and choice. Over time, this strengthens the pathways for conscious decision-making, slowly reducing the dominance of automatic trauma-driven responses. It's important to remember, awareness is not the same as judgment. The goal isn't to condemn ourselves for reacting, but to observe with curiosity. Every reaction once had a purpose. Every wall, every defense was built to protect. By recognizing patterns with compassion, we begin to create space for new possibilities. Awareness is not the finish line, but it is the doorway. Without it, we are condemned to repeat old scripts. With it, we begin to see the difference between the past and the present, and that difference is the foundation for change.